Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 9. Chapter 9 deals with cognitive dissonance theory, and cognitive dissonance theory provides a range of information about how it is and why it is that persuasion takes place, and it offers a lot of principles that we can apply to our daily lives in terms of understanding why it is that we ourselves are persuaded, but also in understanding how it is that we can more effectively design persuasive appeals for other people. So let's get started. So what is dissonance? Dissonance has been described as a negative and unpleasant state or cognition. It tends to manifest when we or other people hold two thoughts or two beliefs that do not align with each other or potentially that oppose each other. And the theory suggests that if we are able to change behavior, or if we're able to evoke a change in behavior, then that can actually cause a change in attitude. Now, this is pretty different than all of the other theories that we've been looking at until now in the course, because the other theories have assumed the opposite, actually, that most attitude behavior connections in persuasion can be shaped in terms of a change in attitude having an effect on behavior, right? So cognitive dissonance theory provides a different lens with which to look at persuasion, and the theory has been tested time and time again in the persuasion literature, and it has been validated many times. So it definitely holds utility for us, and it's a useful theory for us to include in our discussion on persuasion. So as we've stated before, dissonance is a mental state that people tend to find uncomfortable, and it manifests when there are cognitions that do not align with each other. So there are several different types of situations that can contribute to dissonance. One of the first things that can contribute to dissonance is the presence of incongruent thoughts or thoughts that tend to oppose each other in some way. Another contributor to dissonance is when there is an inconsistency between an attitude that we have and a behavior that we are enacting. So, for example, if I have an attitude that reinforces or that holds the importance of having a healthy lifestyle, and I tend to have a weakness for junk food, then we could look at that as a behavior attitude inconsistency. Presumably, according to the assumptions of cognitive dissonance theory, because my attitude about living healthy is an established attitude that I have or carry around with me, when I do eat junk food, then the theory would suggest that there is a uncomfortable state that will emerge from that behavior attitude inconsistency. Dissonance is also created when we have situations in life where we might rule out or omit a beneficial option or some kind of a desirable alternative or option that we could have had the chance to take advantage of. So you could think about this in any number of ways. Let's say you have an opportunity to go to a different location for a vacation, and let's say you're talking with your friends about where you want to go for spring break, and you're trying to decide between Hawaii and Mexico, and maybe the whole group decides that they want to go to Hawaii, but then after you decide that, you realize, oh, I know, but I've been to Hawaii. I've really always wanted to go to Cabo San Lucas. And so perhaps this would be a situation where you might be thinking about, well, that maybe would have been, a little bit more of a enjoyable experience for me, or at least it would have been a new experience for me. And this is just a hypothetical scenario. Oftentimes, this can play out in situations where the consequences are more dire, right? So it's good to just be conscious of what the different issues are that contribute to dissonance. And we're going to obviously go through these in more detail in the upcoming slides here. So omitting a beneficial option can also contribute to dissonance. Another thing that's interesting, and I'm sure all of us can relate to this, is that dissonance is also created when we ourselves find ourselves spending energy on something that is less than ideal, right? So you can think about, for example, the decision to go to a film on a Friday or Saturday night to go see a movie. and maybe you're really excited about the movie and you've heard good things and it has your favorite actors, right? So you carve out about 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours of your life to go and watch this movie, and maybe the movie is really not as ideal, or maybe is not as positive as you were hoping it would be. And so in this situation, you might have dissonance because you feel like you wasted 3 hours and maybe you wasted $10 or $20, right? You could have been doing something that was more useful. And so in that kind of a situation, we might also experience dissonance. Also, we might experience dissonance when we cannot find a sufficient or appropriate psychological justification for an attitude or a behavior that we have. So perhaps you engage in certain types of behaviors that go against attitudes that you have held for a very long time. You can look at this in any number of ways, whether it's your attitudes towards healthy living, or maybe attitudes towards the environment, or attitudes towards your own sense of internal moral or ethics codes, right? So if we were to, let's say, do something in a behavioral component that goes against the values that we have, right, then this would create obviously dissonance. And if we're not able to justify the attitude or behavior that is incongruent, then that of course contributes to further dissonance in our experience. So these are several components that contribute to dissonance, and we're going to be looking at each of these ideas in more detail in the following slides. Now, continuing on with the previous slide, the third component of cognitive dissonance theory is that the dissonance level, or how much dissonance a person experiences, will depend on the number of elements that play into it, so the number of cognitions or attitudes that are relevant for a given situation, or the number of behaviors that may play into it, and of course, how important is this issue to us personally. If we have an attitude behavior inconsistency taking place, but the issue is not really that important to us, then the theory, of course, would suggest that the level of dissonance would be lower than if there was an issue that was important to us. Now, as we started out in this lecture, the main components of the theory assume that people do not like to experience a state of cognitive dissonance. And so when we realize or discover that we are experiencing that, then we want to try to eliminate it. So people do seek to reduce dissonance whenever they discover that it exists. And along these lines, one method for reducing dissonance may work for one person or in a certain situation, but that same method may not work in every situation. And so there are various methods that we may use to reduce dissonance, and we're going to go into each one of them here in the next slide. But it's just important to look at the fact that in different scenarios, we might use different strategies to attempt to reestablish a peaceful or a consonant state of mental and emotional and behavioral consistency. The last stage of the theory admits that not every single attempt to minimize or alleviate dissonance will be effective. So in some of these situations, you might attempt to adopt a new attitude or perhaps change your behavior to try to get rid of a negative attitude or to try to create some consistency between your attitude and behavior connection. But the reality is that it may not always be effective for people. And this can cause people to either try to use a different strategy to reduce dissonance, or they may have to at some point just learn to live with a state of cognitive dissonance. Reducing cognitive dissonance. One thing that people can do in order to reduce cognitive dissonance is you can change your attitude. So I'm going to use the example of attending a film, let's say on a Friday night, and you are expecting that the film is going to be good, and you finish the film and you realize that the movie really isn't that good and it really wasn't that enjoyable to you. So here you are, you've spent 2 or 3 hours of your life, you've spent $20 or $30, and the movie is a big disappointment, right? So one thing that you can do is you can simply change your attitude towards the movie. And so rather than talking or thinking about how disappointing the film was, you can actually start telling yourself, the movie was actually pretty good. A second thing that you can do is you can add different cognitions or thoughts that will hopefully reduce the dissonance that you're experiencing about the disappointing film. So you could say something like, well, the actors were pretty good, and I really enjoyed the special effects in the film. And so in adding these new cognitions, ideally, according to the theory, you would be able to help reduce some of the dissonance that's associated with the negative experience or the negative attitude you have towards the film. And presumably adding such cognitions, such as the actors were good or the special effects were really cool, those kinds of cognitions would help to reduce that negative dissonance that exists because you spent 2 or 3 hours of your life and $20 or $30 on a film that you didn't really enjoy that much. Another option would be that you could derogate the unchosen alternative. So you might say to yourself, well, okay, maybe the movie wasn't that great, but going to a movie is sure better than sitting at home on your own on a Friday night, shuffling through your iPod or surfing the web or watching old Friends reruns or something like that, right? So doing that presumably could also potentially reduce some dissonance that you might be experiencing as a result of attending a film that was somewhat disappointing. Another option is you can spread apart the alternatives. And so let's say, for example, before you actually went to the film, you were feeling the same amount of emotion or the same type of attitude towards the idea of going to the film and the idea of staying home by yourself, right? So now that you had gone to the film and the film really wasn't that good, you might say to yourself, okay, well, maybe initially before the film, I thought that it was going to be about the same level of preference for each of those decisions. So I figured, well, okay, so maybe I'm at about a 5 out of 10 in the decision to go to the film. And I'm also at about a 5 out of 10 in the decision to potentially stay home, right? So if you were to spread apart the alternatives, what it would look like is you would basically start to drop the value in your mind of staying home alone rather than saying, well, I was at about a 5. You might say, well, actually, I was at more about a 2 or a 3 in terms of really wanting to do that. And so really the film was actually the best alternative in that situation, right? So I did the best possible thing I could have done, even if the movie was kind of disappointing. So spreading apart the alternatives is another method that you might use to reduce dissonance. And we're going to go through several more in the next slide here. Another thing that people can do to reduce dissonance after attending a disappointing film or after dealing with any kind of situation, right, is you could alter the importance of the cognitive elements. So when you think about a disappointing film, you're primarily disappointed because you wasted your time, you wasted your money, right? You had expectations for what the film was going to be, and it didn't carry through, it didn't deliver, right? So if you alter the importance of these cognitive elements, you could start to say something to yourself like, well, okay, it's only 2 hours of my life. I have a lot of living left to do. That's not a huge investment, so I really don't need to feel disappointed anymore. Or you could say something to yourself like, well, okay, it was only $20 for the whole night, and that's not a huge chunk of my weekly entertainment budget, so I don't really have to feel that disappointed. So by allowing these different cognitive elements to be introduced and by altering the importance of things like your time or your money, that allows you also to reduce the dissonance that would likely manifest once you attended a film that was not up to par. Another thing that you can do is you can simply suppress thoughts that would create dissonance. And I think that people perhaps do this more than they may want to admit in life. So rather than allowing myself to think about the fact that the movie wasn't good, or rather than allowing myself to create a checklist about what things I didn't like about the movie, I might just suppress the thought that I didn't like the movie, and I might just deny that the movie sucks. And I might start saying to myself, okay, yeah, I expected it to be much better, but the movie was still pretty good. It's okay. It wasn't that bad, right? So that might be something to think about as well in terms of how we manage dissonance. And when have you engaged in suppressing thoughts in order to eliminate a state of dissonance that may have played out? Another thing that we can do is we can communicate about the issue. So we might ask our friends what they thought of the film, right? We might talk about the film with our friends, and we might ask them, well, what did you like about the film? And they could tell us the things that they liked, and they might ask you the same thing, and you could talk about the things that you liked. And in having a communication or a conversation about the film, you might actually be able to convince yourself that the decision to go to the film was a good one. And so this is a process, or this is a strategy that relies on interpersonal communication, right? Because you're not just going to be talking to yourself, but you're going to be talking with other people. And in those kinds of interpersonal support situations, you might be able to convince yourself that you made the right decision, even though on the inside you know that you didn't. Finally, the thing that people can do to reduce dissonance is they can simply alter or change their behavior. So in the case of the movie that we talked about, you might actually get up halfway through the movie and you just might leave, right? You might decide, forget it, I'm not going to even sit in this movie anymore. Because at least if you do that, you might be out the $10 or $20 that it costs to get to the film, but at least you have gained the hour or so that you would have lost if you continue to sit in the movie, right? So these are 8 different ways that people might reduce dissonance when they find that they are experiencing it. Obviously, in real life, we're oftentimes dealing with situations that perhaps are much more important, although I could definitely relate to this idea of going to a film that was disappointing as well. But the general idea here is that these are very important issues or strategies or approaches that we can use to better understand how it is that human beings are convinced, and more importantly, how it is that human beings convince themselves of the actions or attitudes that they choose to enact. So let's continue on. And finish up talking about this important theory. Effort expenditure is an important part of cognitive dissonance theory. And according to this theory, basically the idea is that the more energy or time people tend to invest in an activity, the more positively they will evaluate that activity. So in your textbook on page 241, Aronson and Mills actually talk about how people tend to perceive their membership in groups. And so they talk about an example, which I'm going to refer to later in the slide, of, for example, law students. And they wonder, why is it that law students who have survived tortuous experiences of being asked to cite legal precedent before a class of hundreds come to actually think positively of the same law school professors that have done these things? And why is it that medical interns who are working 30-hour work weeks with barely any sleep are willing to actually defend and view the process of being a medical intern as some kind of a rite of passage for their ability to learn how to practice medicine? Well, these different types of scenarios highlight the importance of the group and the importance of our energy investment, or how much time and effort we expend in a group in terms of influencing how we end up evaluating that group. Your textbook writes on page 241, no matter how attractive a group is to a person, it is rarely completely positive, i.e., usually there are some aspects of the group that an individual does not like. If he has undergone an unpleasant initiation to gain admission to the group, his cognition that he has gone through an unpleasant experience for the sake of membership is dissonant with the cognition that there are things about the group that he does not like. Okay? So this is an interesting situation. Most of us do have memberships in certain groups in our lives. And if you haven't already decided on a career, when you do decide to go down that path, you will also be required to spend energy to learn the education and the practice of it. You will also be spending energy establishing yourself as a professional in the field with other people that are like you, right? So according to the theory, in situations where we spend a lot of energy, or in situations where there's more energy expenditure, we are more likely to convince ourselves that a given group that we participate with is positive. Now, this makes sense, doesn't it? Right? Because if we're spending a lot of our energy doing something, then we want to be able to think at the end of the day that what we are doing is a good thing. And if the group that we are spending our time with is evaluated positively in our own minds, then we're able to have a state of complete positive dissonance, right? Or actually, you're looking at a state that lacks dissonance, right? You have a positive evaluation towards the group, you have a positive evaluation towards yourself, and then you have a positive evaluation towards your participation with the group, right? So these types of mental processes allow us to justify spending the time and the energy and the effort that it takes in order to be a member of certain types of organizations or groups. And these types of ideologies or attitudes or beliefs are also passed down to other people, right? So I gave the example at the beginning of this slide of law students who are still able and willing to evaluate their professors in a positive way, even after receiving sometimes grueling interviews or questioning by the very professors that they will end up recommending, right, to future law students that are coming into the program. Or you might be dealing with medical interns or even people who are going to grad school, right? Let's say you're in a graduate program and it's highly competitive and your cohort and you work very, very hard together, and maybe you have some professors that are a little bit hard-nosed, right? And you end up evaluating those professors positively at the end of the experience, even though they caused you some struggle and they caused you to have to, really push yourself. But having to push yourself in order to achieve the things that are meaningful in life actually comes to be viewed as a positive thing, right? And so this is one way that we can justify spending our energy in involvement with a group. And of course, we pass on these beliefs to other people that are coming later. Now, sometimes belonging to a certain group might require a significant amount of energy and participation, and sometimes the energy might actually become too much of a requirement. So people may actually engage in thoughts or experiences that can actually work against their membership in the group. And so let's talk about a few situations here. So we look at Greek membership, for example, and oftentimes in Greek membership initiations, there are certain types of rituals that are required. The process of hazing is still often a part of many of the Greek practices, even if it's an informal part. And so this could be something that might lead people to decide they just simply do not want to be a part of an organization such as a Greek membership organization. Also, you might look at the way in which religious culture is passed on to individuals in their systems, in their cultural systems. So, for example, young Jewish children, or you can think about young Catholic or Christian children as well. They might spend many days of their weekends learning about Jewish culture and about Hebrew. If you're in, a Catholic or a Christian church, you may also spend several hours a week learning a religious education as well. And so the time spent on learning about the culture may actually be dissonant or create dissonance with the knowledge that, the kids could be outside playing or doing things that are more fun, right? But at the end of the day, when you spend time engaging in a group-based activity, the participation and the effort that they have spent on that group and on that activity actually leads people to start to evaluate or experience it in a positive way. So this is one way that rituals and religions are able to establish themselves, perpetuate themselves, and pass on those values to future generations that are coming later. Now, in some cases, the level of energy that's required to be a part of a group or the type of participation that people have to engage in may go against their values or something like that. Or it just simply is too much time of an investment, right? So in these situations, people may trivialize the initiation or rituals. They may decide that the membership in this particular group is not actually worth it. And in these cases, people may actually decide that they do not want to be a part of the group. So group membership does not always induce a state of positivity, but sometimes it can actually work against membership issues, right? And it's important to take away the idea that cognitive dissonance theory identifies not only that in states of dissonance, we seek to reduce it, and of course it identifies several ways that people may do that, but it also accounts for the role that group and collective mentality may have in the different attitudes and behaviors that we decide to adopt. And it also acknowledges that the level of effort or energy that people spend investing in a group or in a cultural system will most likely shape the way that they end up evaluating that culture. And in many cases, they will end up evaluating it more positively, but that doesn't always play out in that way. Sometimes it can actually backfire, and sometimes the very rituals and traditions that are intended to assimilate people into the group can actually backfire and cause people to not want to be a part of the group because they may not want to do those particular rituals, or they may just see the group membership as too demanding in terms of time investment. Induced compliance is also something that we want to pay attention to in the persuasion discussion using cognitive dissonance theory. So in some situations, people may actually be coaxed or induced into taking on a behavior or an attitude that they don't actually believe because somebody is willing to offer them some kind of a reward. So let's say somebody offers to pay you some money to take on a belief that you don't actually believe, right? But they want you to endorse that belief because they want you to be their spokesperson or something, right? So when induced compliance is taking place, basically people are choosing to take an action freely, okay, that is against their beliefs or their attitudes. It's counter-attitudinal because it's very irrational, being that we know how we feel about things and what we think. And so when compliance is induced through any number of potential rewards that somebody or someone can offer us, then it places us potentially in a dissonant situation, doesn't it? So as I said a second ago, if someone were to pay you to endorse a certain position, that would be a great situation of induced compliance. So your book gives an example. Let's say that you were giving a speech that advocated banning cell phones in cars, although privately you didn't actually agree with that position, right? Let's say you use your cell phone every day in your car, right? But you have someone who wants you to endorse their position. And so let's say that they pay you $1 or $5 in order to promote that position, okay? Now, according to dissonance theory, based on your induced compliance to promote an agenda or a position that you actually don't agree with, dissonance theory would actually predict that under those circumstances, you would actually begin to evaluate that proposal in a favorable way, even though initially it went against your initial feeling or beliefs on the issue, okay? So it's kind of an interesting phenomena, and they call them counter-attitudinal because the individuals are performing a behavior that is counter-attitudinal, and really you can't rationalize it. And so because of that, they are in a state of dissonance, okay? So one way that you could reduce dissonance with that kind of a situation would be to change your attitude, right? So that your attitude is more consistent with the behavior. To wrap up this lecture on cognitive dissonance theory, we're going to look at a study that was conducted by Festinger and Carl Smith. And what they did was they brought a bunch of students into a lab, and they had different students perform 2 boring tasks. So some of the students were assigned a task of spooling, like spooling some thread or something, and other students were assigned a task of turning pegs. And I'm sure that all of you who are listening to this lecture would be so happy to be able to participate in such a fun and invigorating study, right? Okay, so we have the students, they were brought into the lab, and they were doing these various activities, right? Okay. So some of the students were paid $20, and some of the students were paid $1, okay? There was also a control group, and the control group were not paid anything, okay? So the experimenter then asked the students to do them a favor. So what they said is, well, okay, we know that you're doing spooling and we know that you're turning pegs, but we really appreciate it if you could do us this favor and please tell the next person who is coming after you that this was a really fun and enjoyable task and that it was exciting and it was a lot of fun, okay? And so this type of a scenario was really just a way to induce dissonance to see how it was that students performed. So what they found was that the people who were paid only $1 to tell the lie about the task being enjoyable actually ended up evaluating the task more favorably than the people who were paid $20. Now, this doesn't necessarily make sense because for some of us, we might be thinking, well, the students that were paid more money might be enjoying the activity more, even if they did get induced to tell a lie. But the reality is that the people who were paid $1 were sitting in a situation where they actually had to convince themselves that the task was enjoyable so that they could feel good about it, right? So according to the theory, the cognition that the spooling, removing, and the peg turning tasks were really boring was dissonant with the cognition of just telling someone that it was lots of fun, okay? So the people who were paid $20 to lie had a external justification for telling the lie, right? Because they got $20. Except the people that got $1, it was a different situation. The people who were paid $1 didn't actually have external justification for the inconsistency between what they thought and what their lie was, right? So in order to resolve that inconsistency, they had to turn inward in order to deal with it. So what they did, and what the study established, is that the students that were paid $1 to do a boring task and tell a lie actually ended up changing their internal attitude towards the task, all right? So by convincing themselves that the thing with the spools wasn't so bad, it gave me a chance to do something, to work on hand-eye coordination or yada yada, right? They could actually begin to feel comfortable with the fact that they told fellow students that were coming later, I had a lot of fun. And so basically by adopting a new attitude, they were able to reduce dissonance, and thus they were able to restore cognitive harmony. So this is perhaps one of the most interesting studies that I've read in cognitive dissonance theory. And what's so interesting about these findings is that we really do see how under certain conditions, people are actually willing to modify their internal attitude so that they are able to achieve some kind of sense of consistency between a behavior that perhaps is not desirable and an attitude that doesn't align, okay? So there are many important ideas that we discussed in cognitive dissonance theory, but to wrap up this lecture, we want to be aware of the fact that cognitive dissonance theory, in comparison and in contrast to many of the other theories that we've talked about thus far in our course, cognitive dissonance theory suggests that we can actually induce an attitudinal change in people if we are able to get them to publicly endorse a certain type of stance or adopt a certain behavior, okay? And this is in comparison or in contrast to the other theories that we've looked at, which have primarily sought to change behavior by changing someone's attitude first, okay? So this theory is actually the opposite, but there are still very important findings from the research that's been done. And as persuasion experts, what we can take away from this theory in this chapter is that the only road to persuasion is not necessarily only going to be through changing attitudes first, that we can indeed change someone's attitude or a group's attitude if we are able to get them to enact a behavior that is in alignment with the behavior that we want them or the attitude that we want them to adopt. Hopefully this lecture has been informative, and thank you very much for your attention. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you all in the next chapter.